Landings. Can we have the safety video, please?
Welcome to the Durban ICC, where the world meets Africa. As a leading world-class events facility, we make your safety our #1 priority. Please give us your attention for a few minutes to take you through some important health and safety information. As the Durban ICC is a public space, please remember to keep your personal belongings safe and with you at all times. We have many bathrooms for you to use around the venue. They are clearly marked in the foyer and concourse areas. The Durban ICC is a smoke-free building, but we do have clearly marked smoking zones outside the main entrance and in the courtyards opposite the concourse. Please make use of these areas and the ashtrays provided when you smoke. In the event of a medical emergency, please dial the emergency number 031 360 1111 for assistance. The Durban ICC has developed a very simple emergency evacuation plan that everyone must be familiar with. Our staff are specially trained and will be there to assist you in following this plan. In the event of an evacuation, an announcement will be made to leave the venue. Please remain calm and walk swiftly to the nearest emergency exit in the concourse area. These exit doors are clearly marked. Security guards and the marshals will also help direct you out of the building. Please do not use any lifts or escalators in the event of an emergency. Once outside, you will be directed to the nearest assembly point by the marshals for your safety. Please wait at the assembly point until the venue has been cleared and the marshal deems it safe for you to return to your seats. Thank you for your time and enjoy this event.
Thank you very much for that safety video. Ladies and gentlemen, can we please stand so we can sing the national anthem? And then thereafter we will observe a moment of silence, and all of us being a diverse community of our different faiths, we will allow for a minute of silence for all those families that have lost loved ones in the floods of last year, and those families that were affected by the mini tornado that hit Durban. And very importantly, for those families that are still not placed in a home yet, where their homes were damaged, and those families that have never recovered loved ones that we lost in the April floods of last year. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's have the national anthem. Can we have the national anthem, please? Please remain standing so we can just observe a moment of silence for all those families that were affected by the recent floods and the past floods. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Please be seated. Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, this is the Mayor's climate change workshop. And as you know, the Mayor has been championing the climate change agenda in the city, giving political leadership on the interventions and the adaptation and mitigation strategies that the city needs to implement. But as you know, you've always got to work harder. It's a constant journey. So in the city system, the Mayor is the political head of our climate change agenda, and he's going to come talk to us later this morning. The Mayor was called to a meeting with the President on a number of critical government issues, and I am convinced that the Mayor will be in a position to also brief the President on the recent incidents of flooding, particularly in the Inanda Phoenix Inanda Phoenix area, and to ensure that the President is updated and briefed, so that when the city management has to put plans together, because as you know, these climate change interventions, so these climate change episodes, forces the administration of the city to begin to reprioritize budgets. And those budgets have been planned and set, and there comes a time when we need to ensure that both province and national government can support the financial contributions and the financial obligations of the climate change issues that are confronting us as a city. But as we're going to hear today, money is not the only solution to some of the things that we need to do. So our city manager, he is the administrative head of the city. Him, together with Mr. Lihle Pewa, coordinates a administrative climate change and integrated climate change program in the city. We basically take the document that council has approved and that Mayor has got council approval for, and that document now is in the office of the city manager and the deputy city manager for economic development and planning, the acting deputy city manager, Mr. Lihle Pewa, and he's been driving a program with a very dedicated team to have an integrated climate change adaptation and mitigation strategy. So ladies and gentlemen, today is about that. You know, we're going to hear more about what are the things we've done that are working well, but also more importantly, what are those things that we still need to do or we need to strengthen to make our city resilient and make us be in a position. Because, you know, I have lived all my life in the city, and some of the recent floods, I mean, I was just doing some research last night, and since 2016, the city has become increasingly hit by heavy downpours that have impacted on the city, the life of the city, and also given the economic downturn globally and in our country, and the impact of COVID, it just kind of became a perfect storm, really, that knocked us. And we've got to find ways now together of how do we come out of this difficult time at the moment. So ladies and gentlemen, so today is that learning journey. We are continuing that learning journey together and tackling the impact of climate change. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like to call up now our speaker to give us a welcome address, our political leader who represents the council, the leadership of the city. Councillor Nyawose, please. Let's give him a round of applause.
Yeah, thank you very much, Program Director. Before maybe I deliver my short message, I've been requested by our media team that it's becoming difficult for them to record the proceedings and to take pictures because the hall is not yet full. Now they are humbly making a request for those who are sitting at the back to come and occupy the seat in the front, so that those who are watching at home, because we are live on Facebook, in our Facebook page, at least the summit looks much better in terms of the views and those who are watching us on the screen. Can we humbly request that you come in the front for them to take nice and good pictures, please. Thank you very much for that. Program Director allows me to stand on the protocol that has been already observed, but I see that the Deputy Mayor, Councillor Mini, is here. Welcome. Thank you, Councillor Mini, for coming. I've seen councillors, many from the committee, and some councillors are also here. Officials from various community organizations that are all here. You are all welcome. Thank you very much for coming to this important event from us as the city leadership. In welcoming you, I want to raise a few points on behalf of the municipality. I won't say much about what we experienced on Tuesday as a result of extreme weather events that led to the floods and that mini tornado that you saw that heavily affected our people around, mainly around Phoenix and Wamashu and also Inanda. We have lost lives. There are people who are still missing. We hope we will find those people because our team, they are working hard to find those people. But it is very much important to mention in this gathering that as the eThekwini municipality, we had the climate change committee since 2015. It means from 2015, as a municipality, we have established the climate change committee. Then in 2019, we were the first city to launch the climate change action plan. If you compare to all other metros in our country, we have been leading when it comes to climate change issues because we take them very serious. Thirdly, we have had a shared climate partnership with our municipal neighbors since 2014. This issue has not been an issue for us as a city, but we have shared it with other people. Some metros do come to our city to share knowledge, to learn, and to engage us on this subject. Hence, I'm saying we have been a leader in the climate change for over a decade, because we take this matter very serious. Today we are here, or we convene to bring us together in a shared understanding of a climate change. Our administrative leaders, DCMs, heads of departments, and senior officials will share with you their progress from the aligned departments where they are responsible. Then, after taking you through on the details plan, they have been implemented and those we intend to implement from various departments. At the last session, we will discuss how to bring representatives from eThekwini society in the Climate Change Committee. In all the presentation that will be done here today, what we expect as a city leadership is to find out that how are we going to involve the community organizations? How are we going to involve our people in the Climate Change Committee? Because this matter cannot be a matter of the aspects alone. It can't be a matter of a department. It's supposed to be a matter that involves everyone in local government. Now, you can't talk about local government and exclude citizens. We expect you to come up with proposals on how are we going to involve communities in this program. This will also assist or help to prepare for the Climate Change Act, so that when we're moving closer to have an act on the climate change, then views, proposals, ideas from eThekwini are catered for. Again, we don't want views of individuals, views of groupings. We want a view or proposals that come from the people of eThekwini, where councillors are involved, communities are also involved. To deal with climate change will require a political will to drive the city's climate change program. I'm here on behalf of Council, representing 222 councillors from 111 wards and our PR councillors. I'm here as well representing the community of eThekwini. Being here is a sign of speaker to say, Council, citizens of eThekwini, we want to partner with you. We want to work with you. We are going to support you. We understand our role very well. We are the policymakers. Experts can talk. People can raise concerns and frustrations. But a policy has to be made. In this case, people of eThekwini have elected us to make such decision. There is a political will from the side of council to make decisions, policies, bylaws, if a need arises, as a sign of commitment to this program. Let me conclude, Program Director, by just indicating to you our intentions. as a city. We are here today as councillors to learn, to be empowered with information, and to understand issues of climate change much better, particularly on how it affects or impacts in the lives of our people. But once we've been empowered, we intend to communicate with all our councillors to say that in all their community meetings, stakeholder engagements, there must be a standard item on climate change. Wherever our people are meeting in the eThekwini municipality convened by councillors, there must be a standard item on climate change. We are going to partner with the relevant department so that in those community engagement, we request that an official is assigned so that they speak in detail on that subject. That is a political will, and that is a commitment that we are making. Because we have a responsibility as a Speaker's office to inform, empower, and educate citizens. Now we're going to use that power given to us by council to drive programs of climate change straight to our communities. We hope that at the end of the financial year, this program will give us positive results in terms of our people, our communities being involved and have more understanding on how to participate and to fight issues of climate change. That is a commitment, and I hope Council will support that, and all councillors and all community organizations will cooperate and work with us. Thank you very much. You are all welcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Nyawosa, Speaker of eThekwini Municipality, for that commitment and ensuring that the political will and the participation of our councillors and the people of our city are also part of this journey. So I want to check, can someone from the ICC please tell the DJs there that the party is tomorrow, not today, for the July, that they must just tone the music down. We don't want to be disturbed. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to part of the program that I think all of us are looking forward to, and we're really honored to have in our midst Dr. Deborah Roberts, a PhD scientist that really is a leading light in the issues around climate change in our city and our country and globally. She's an honorary professor at the university. She is imparting that knowledge to young people, but also she's also imparted that knowledge to her own team here in the city system, and she's our resilience chief in the city. And the fascinating thing is that Deborah Roberts is a native of this city. And I think Durban has a tendency to produce some amazing people, you know. Although Kaizer Chiefs and London Pirates steals all our best players, but I don't think they'll steal Deborah Roberts. They can't. But the reality is that, and we are really honored that she's been chosen to lead a number of international panels of experts in the United Nations, in the various COP platforms that are running globally, the United Nations, UN Habitat. So Durban, through Bushen, to the issues of adaptation and mitigation around climate change. And we are really honored that she can come here today in a busy schedule and really impart some of that knowledge, but also give us a sense of where we are, what more needs to be done. And I know I've kind of half consulted with her in that after her address, She's quite happy to take a few questions. And just for, we do have some translation services for people that when Zulu and English or any other language is spoken, but I think it's Zulu and English are the main languages. If that, when the need comes up, we do have some speakerphones, some headphones for people that need a translation service from Zulu to English or English to Zulu. So ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I would like now to invite Dr. Deborah Roberts to the podium and impart some of her wisdom and pearls of wisdom to us, and also give us a sense of what is the journey ahead and what are the tasks ahead. Dr. Deborah, let's give her a round of applause. And I know I didn't tell her to wear apple green outfit today. She chose it herself.
Thank you, Eric, and for commending my fashion choices. And good morning, Durban. Yes, at least there's life out there. This is good. Let me start off by acknowledging our Deputy Mayor, Mr. Speaker, the councillors present, municipal colleagues, and everyone else in the room who's interested in climate change. The Speaker indicated he was here representing the Council of 222 councillors. I'm here today not in my local government capacity, but in my role as a scientist working on climate change. So I'm here to talk to the science. And I know that generally strikes fear into the heart of most councillors and municipal officials. But the fact is, in this very complex world that we now live in, we must consider science to be an important part of the toolbox we use to make the very difficult decisions that are required to deal with the polycrises, the many crises that we are facing on a day-to-day basis. And so it's a responsibility we have as people on the ground who need to act, to use the evidence that is available to us, to become familiar with the science. And what I'll be doing today is talking about some of the work that we've done in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and bringing you some of the key messages that has emerged from our recent synthesis report for the 6th assessment cycle. So yes, it works, which is great. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. The one thing that the scientific community likes to do is to talk in acronyms. So you'll hear me referring to the IPCC. It's a part of the UN set of organizations. It was established in 1988 to provide policymakers and practitioners with an objective source of information around human-induced climate change. What causes it, what are its impacts, and probably most importantly to us in this room today, how do we respond to it? And the way that the IPCC works is we work in assessment cycles. They're generally about 5 to 7 years long. We're currently at the tail end of the 6th assessment cycle. It will in fact end in a couple of weeks. This has been the longest and busiest by far of the IPCC's assessment cycles. There are 3 working groups in the IPCC that are responsible for producing the assessment reports, and we've been very busy. We've produced 3 special reports, and I'm sure at least some of you in the room will recall our special report on 1.5 degrees of global warming. It in fact formed or informed the development of Durban's Climate Action Plan. But we've also produced a special report on land, which is of great significance to Africa. We've produced a special report on oceans and cryosphere, so those are the frozen parts of the world. And we've produced 3 big global assessment reports. First, looking at the physical science of climate change. The second, looking at impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability to climate change. And the third, mitigation of climate change. And the messages from those many thousands of pages, that would be over some 12,000 pages of scientific report, we've pulled forward in a synthesis report, and we released that globally in March of this year. So let's stand back and look at some of the big messages. What is the science telling us as residents of Durban, as leaders of Durban? It's important to recognize that the science is no longer playing diplomacy. It's no longer pulling its punches. It's giving us a very direct reading on the state of the world. And one of the big findings is that the current trends in our emissions, so those are the gases we produce from the use of fossil fuels and clearing land, and our current development choices are simply incompatible with a sustainable and equitable world. And this shouldn't come as a surprise to us. We've had over a century of unsustainable fossil fuel use. We've had over a century of unsustainable energy use, unsustainable land use. And to see just how unequal and unsustainable the world is, consider the fact that the 10% highest emitting households in the world are responsible for about 40% of the greenhouse gas emissions, while the 50% of households, the 50%, and the bulk of those would be in places like Africa, with the lowest emissions, are responsible for less than 15%. So we can see a very unequal distribution in terms of the causes of the problem. We can also see that the planet we live on is changing extremely rapidly. The global surface temperature has increased faster since 1970, and I can't be the only person in the room who remembers 1970, than any other 50-year period in at least the last 2,000 years. When we produced our first special report in 2018, we indicated that the increase in global average temperature compared to the pre-industrial times, and we use 1850 to 1900 as a proxy for those times, was on the order of 1.1 degrees Celsius. If you look at our synthesis report, we've updated that figure to 1.15. And you're probably sitting there and thinking, well, 0.5 of a degree, does that really matter? I'll tell you it matters a great deal, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. And because of human-induced climate change, we're now seeing very rapid changes in all aspects of our planet's systems. We're seeing rapid changes in the atmosphere, the ocean, in the frozen parts of the world, and in the living parts of the world. So the question is why? How have we backed ourselves into this tremendously dangerous corner we find ourselves in as a human society? Is it because we didn't know? Is it because we didn't have the science available to us? Sadly, the answer is no. We've known about the greenhouse effect since the early 1800s. We've known about greenhouse gases and how those contribute to the warming of the atmosphere. As early as 1938, a Scottish scientist known as Guy Callendar calculated the increase in atmospheric temperature over land to be on the order of about 0.3 to 0.4 degrees. And he deduced at that particular point in time that half of that was due to the carbon dioxide we were producing as humans. So we've known for a really long time, due to the science, that there was a problem. We slowly began to realize the extent of the problem and really began acting towards the late 1980s. That's when the IPCC was established in 1988. It produced its first assessment report in 1990 and concluded that in 1990, the global average temperature had increased by half a degree. Now, that report was so influential, so we can see the power of science, that it contributed to the establishment of the UNFCCC, or the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's the convention under which all of the nations in the world come together at least once a year to negotiate international climate change policy. And if you cast your minds back to 2011, in this very place, we had one of those negotiations happening around COP17, and there was a great buzz around climate change in the city. The first Conference of the Parties, or climate negotiations, occurred in 1995. Sadly, what we've seen since then is an escalation in the number of COPs. We're actually heading towards COP28 in the UAE at the end of this year. And equivalently, we've seen an increase in the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If we look at the readings from NOAA in the US, we're currently sitting at 421 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, that's a significant increase, because if you look at pre-industrial times, before we started the Industrial Revolution, the level was 280 parts per million over the 6,000 years of our early civilization. So we can see how dramatically things have changed. So what do these changes mean? It means that we have seen widespread and dangerous impacts both on natural systems and people around the world. We've seen an increase in extreme events, extreme heat events, heat waves, which have increased human mortality. We've seen mass diebacks of trees on land and corals in the ocean. We've seen an increase in the intensity and frequency of heavy rainfall events. Durban knows this only too well the last couple of days, but also think back to the major floods that we had in April and May of last year. Climate science is now advanced so that we can detect the fingerprint of climate change in these extreme events. And those floods in April and May last year, the scientists have calculated, were twice as likely to have happened because of climate change. And we all know the devastation it's caused in our city, the damage to infrastructure that we're still recovering from, the loss of lives that you never recover from, the impacts on our ecosystem. So climate change is a very real part of the lives of everyone living in Durban. We've seen an increase in agricultural droughts. The proportion of tropical cyclones has increased. Just speak to people who live in Mozambique about the impacts of tropical cyclones. We've seen reduced water security. At least half of the people in the world today experience some form of water scarcity at least once during the year. Millions of people are exposed to acute food insecurity currently around the world, with the bulk of those, unsurprisingly, occurring in Africa, in Asia, the least developed countries, South and Central America, the small island states in the Arctic, so the very vulnerable parts of the world. We've also seen the growth in agricultural productivity being reduced. In Africa since 1961, because of climate change, our agricultural productivity has dropped by 34%. It's the biggest drop in the world on a continent which is so beset by food insecurity. We've seen reduced fish and shellfish yields because the oceans are warming, they're getting more acidic. We've seen intensified impacts in cities because of extreme heat, because of the floods. That has led to loss of infrastructure, as we've seen in our own city, the loss of livelihoods and lives. And we're seeing economic impacts in economic sectors that are exposed to the climate, like agriculture, forestry, service provision, infrastructure, and so on. We know that the world is changing, and as the speaker indicated, here in Durban, for example, we have been acting, we've been responding. But when we look at this at a global level, although we acknowledge that action is happening, it's very clear that we are not doing enough. Even in Durban, we are not doing enough. The pace and scale of what we've done so far is simply not adequate to tackle climate change. So everything on the books, we need to increase. We need to be more ambitious. We need to be acting more rapidly. So how do we act? There are really two possibilities for us to respond to this enormous challenge. One is adaptation, and that's about adjusting our systems to deal with the changes that we're currently experiencing and that we will experience, that are already baked into the system that we can no longer avoid. When we look at the science, we can see that adaptation indeed has progressed at the global level. We see it across all sectors and regions, but it remains fragmented, it remains incremental, and remains sector-specific. And so we see adaptation gaps emerging. A gap between what we should be doing to change our systems to adapt to climate change and what we are doing. And those adaptation gaps are simply going to continue growing if we continue with our existing plans, and they will have the biggest impact on the poor and vulnerable in society. If we look at where we've been successful with adaptation, it's largely in the agricultural sector. So we're scoring wins in terms of on-farm water management, in terms of improving soil moisture conservation. We've definitely improved ecosystem-based adaptation, for example, through urban greening. So think of those large community reforestation projects that we have at Buffels Dry Landfill site and in Nanda. These are important steps forward in urban greening. But we're already encountering some limits to adaptation. There are already ecosystems around the world that are at risk from climate change. So the warm water corals, the coastal wetlands, rainforests, the polar and mountain ecosystems. We're also seeing some communities hitting limits to adaptation. So for example, the small-scale farmers and households in coastal regions, because they don't have supporting policies. There isn't enough money to help them adapt. And adaptation finance is of critical concern. Because when we look at finance at the global level and track that, only a small proportion is going to adaptation. By far, the bulk is going into mitigation. What we've also been able to assess in this assessment cycle is something we refer to as maladaptation. So where adaptation actions are being taken, we're seeing unintended consequences emerge from those actions sometimes that have negative impacts. So think about the fact that as the world warms, for example, Durban gets hotter, we might respond by putting air conditioners in all of our buildings. What does that do? It creates greenhouse gas emissions that continue to drive climate change, so you get a negative feedback system. And of course, it's the poor and vulnerable again who are most affected by maladaptation. And a very important finding is we can no longer adapt our way out of this problem. Even if today we put all the money in the world behind adaptation and put our best feet forward in terms of our adaptation action, we can no longer avoid losses and damages. We are going to experience permanent losses. We are going to experience damages no matter what we do at this particular point in time. In terms of mitigation, so that's the other major platform for response. We've got to stop those greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere, and when they're in the atmosphere, we've got to create sinks that enable them to be pulled out. Here again, we are seeing progress. Policies and laws around the world have expanded, and the speaker spoke to the fact that South Africa itself is working towards a climate act. But the pledges that have been made to reduce greenhouse gas emissions just before the COP in Glasgow in 2021 make it much harder to limit global warming to 2 degrees. We also see that there's substantial gaps between the pledges that have been made and the policies that have been implemented at the end of 2020. So we exist in a situation where we've got the Paris Agreement, and at that point I was very fortunate to still be a negotiator for South Africa. So we have this ambitious agreement that countries at a global scale have signed and ratified, which indicates that countries are committing to keep global warming well below 2 degrees Celsius and to pursue 1.5. The problem is the commitments we've put in place to realize that level of ambition create a huge ambition gap. The commitments don't match the level of ambition. And the real challenge is that even with those commitments on the table, what is actually being done creates an implementation gap. So we're very far off the mark in terms of realizing the ambition of the Paris Agreement. What mitigation has happened to date? As I say, there has been progress. We've seen expanding policies worldwide to reduce greenhouse gas emissions over the last decade, including at the subnational level. And again, Durban is committed to that through its climate action plan. And we've seen an increase in the response options available to us, the growth of solar and wind energy, improved energy efficiency, demand-side management, the electrification of urban systems, of course, using low-carbon sources, the focus on green infrastructure in cities. Crop and grassland management has improved. We're seeing a reduction in food waste. But unfortunately, in the developing countries of the world, we're seeing lags in adoption of these low-emission technologies because of lack of finance and the difficulties with technology development and transfer. And even though the bulk of climate finance is going into mitigation, it still falls very far short of realizing the goals that we have in the Paris Agreement. We need about 3 to 6 times more finance in order to be able to finance the level of ambition we see in the Paris Agreement. And so where do we land? We have to be honest with ourselves. We are very poorly prepared for the hazards and the extraordinary threats we face today and will face into the future. The science helps us understand what that future might look like. Clearly, we've got a tough present, but how much tougher is it going to get in the future due to climate change? We've seen several scientific advances which allow us to get a much better understanding of what the future will look like, depending on the choices that each one of us in the room make today and going forward. The hard news is that because of the lack of ambition, because our efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions have been insufficient, the increase in global average temperature is more likely than not to reach 1.5 degrees Celsius in the early part of the 2030s. And this is significant because all the science points to the fact that while we live in an extremely difficult world, even at 1.15, once we cross 1.5, it becomes a very dangerous world. It poses an existential threat to us and the ecosystems we rely on. And so we find ourselves in a situation where the slides are not moving. Can someone advance the slide for me? I think we may have run out of battery power, which would be ironic. There we go. We find ourselves in a situation where our development choices have put us on this huge carbon-intensive superhighway, and we're barreling along, producing all sorts of emissions. We've got a very limited opportunity to get off that highway, to go to a neighborhood where we limit the world's temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But we've got to acknowledge that even limiting the world's temperature to 1.5 degrees Celsius will mean that we live in a much more dangerous place than we do now. And why is that the case? We know from the scientific work that for every small increment of warming, every 1/10 of a degree, every 100th of a degree, the risks and impact and the related losses and damages increase. So every tiny increase in temperature ratchets up the challenges we have to face. And we also know from the latest science that we enter into that high-risk zone at much lower temperatures than we previously have thought about. So we think about systems like our unique and threatened ecosystems, we think about extreme weather events, and we find that we enter into the high-risk zone with those at far lower temperatures than we previously thought. So what does the future look like? Simply put, future emissions mean further warming, and that means continued changes in all aspects of the planetary system. That means every region, and no region will be exempt, will be impacted by, for example, things like an increase in tropical cyclone intensity, the melting of ice and snow, which drives sea level rise, and you combine sea level rise with storm surges or high tides, you get flooding. We're going to see biodiversity loss, reduced food production, and huge impacts on human health. Things like heat-related deaths, the spread of diseases like malaria and cholera, mental health challenges, and malnutrition. We're also going to see a change in extremes. They're going to become more noticeable. You've just got to live in Durban to see that happening. And we're going to have to deal with compound and cascading risks, so risks coming together and affecting one another, and those are much more difficult for us to manage. So think of an example where you've got extreme heat and drought coming together. That means you lose soil moisture, becomes much more difficult to grow crops. But if it's hot outside, you battle to work. So you've got reduced household income, you've got reduced food production. That drives food insecurity. Food prices increase locally, potentially globally. We get reduced food security, get increased malnutrition and decreased quality of life. And this is not an abstract example. If you look at recent papers on the drought that's happened in the Horn of Africa, we've been able to detect that climate footprint in that drought. And as a result of that drought, 4.35 million people have needed humanitarian aid. I do think the batteries are getting tired. So from our assessment, what we've done is we've looked at an increasingly warming world, and what that shows us is that every region will face further increases in climate hazards in the near future, and these adverse impacts are simply going to increase the warmer the world gets. So if we think of our annual hottest days, those are going to get hotter and hotter. We will experience more extreme events from a heat perspective as the world warms up, particularly in the mid-latitudes and some of the semi-arid regions of the world. Soil moisture will also decrease in a warmer world. That means it's going to be more difficult to sustain ecosystems, to grow crops. We're also going to risk the loss of species. And this is significant because science has really pointed to the fact that those natural ecosystems are absolutely vital to support our livelihoods and to support a sustainable development path. If you think a world that's warmed at 1.5 degrees and compare it to a world at 3 degrees, the risk of species extinction in the world's biodiversity hotspots, and our city is located in one of those biodiversity hotspots, increases by 10-fold. There are also risks to human health. If we have the combination of heat and humidity coming together under these high temperatures, you've got a risk of increasing human mortality. And if you look at those higher temperatures, so global average temperature increase above 4 degrees Celsius, it really calls into question whether some parts of the world will be habitable, particularly in the tropics. And we know in the tropics we have many poor and vulnerable communities. It also impacts on food production. The warmer it gets, the more difficult it is to produce staple crops like maize. You get a decrease in the yield of fisheries. And just think about the huge coastline that Africa has, with many poor communities being subsistence fishers, relying on those fisheries for their protein intake. And so we can see yet again that climate change impacts affect the poor and the vulnerable the most. What is very clear from the science, as I've said before, is we can no longer avoid losses and damages. They're going to be a part of our future. They're going to disproportionately affect the most vulnerable people and ecosystems in the world. But the decisions we take today can help limit the extent of those impacts. We're definitely tiring the battery here. So why are we reaching limits? It's simply because as the world gets hotter, your adaptation options become more constrained. They become less effective. We're going to reach adaptation limits. A lot of governments are relying on the use of ecosystem-based adaptation, but if the ecosystems are negatively impacted by increasing temperatures, they won't be able to play that role. We're going to reach limits in terms of water management. So think of a world above 1.5 degrees Celsius. There'll be insufficient fresh water available to communities living on some island states and in some mountain areas because they rely on snowmelt and glacier melt. There'll be irreversible changes, such as loss of species, the loss of biodiversity and ecosystems, particularly those that are already under threat. So those warm water corals, the coastal wetlands, the rainforests, and the polar ecosystems. There'll be dangerous feedbacks occurring in the climate system. As it warms, we'll see thawing of the permafrost in the northern hemisphere, which will release carbon back into the atmosphere and drive further climate change. We'll see unavoidable sea level rise. We're already committed to sea level rise over centuries and millennia, but we can limit the level of acceleration by actions today. And we know that we'll experience above 1.5 severe infrastructure damage in our cities because of heat and flooding, and particularly impacts in low-lying coastal settlements. By the middle of the century, we'll have 1 billion people impacted by sea level rise on small islands and in coastal cities. So it's very clear the science is saying that climate change is not something that's remote. It's really an existential threat to our well-being, to our livelihoods, to the global economy, and the nature on which we rely to survive and thrive. But as you can see from the presentation I've made, increasingly questions of equity and justice are entering our climate change assessments because it's the vulnerable people, those 50% of households responsible for less than 15% of emissions, who've contributed least to climate change, who are being most heavily impacted by the impacts of climate change. We currently live in a world where almost half of the world's population, so 3.3 to 3.6 billion people, live in hotspots of vulnerability to climate change. Between 2010 and 2020, the deaths from floods, droughts, and storms were 15 times higher in the highly vulnerable regions of the world, to the global south compared to the global north. And exposure to climate hazards just continues to grow due to growing inequality, growing levels of urbanization. We're going through the most rapid period of urbanization in our species' history, and other trends such as migration. Those people who rely directly on the land and the sea for their livelihoods are also immediately impacted and particularly vulnerable. And so it's really clear, without strong and urgent action, losses and damages will continue to disproportionately affect the poor and vulnerable around the world. And unfortunately, again, Africa will be in that lineup along with Asia, South America, the least developed countries, the small islands, and the Arctic. And so in 2018, when we released our first special report on 1.5 of global warming, we indicated that the science very clearly indicates that if we're going to try and limit global warming to 1.5, it's going to be a very challenging path. 5 years on, we can say that that challenge has become much, much greater. So what do we do? In this decade, it's particularly important to ramp up our adaptation work, to accelerate adaptation interventions and finance to close that adaptation gap. From a mitigation point of view, if we're serious about pursuing 1.5 or limiting temperatures to well below 2, we need immediate, deep, and rapid cuts in emissions. In fact, we should be peaking global emissions at 2025, which means emissions should be declining as we sit here today. They're not. They're in fact going up. And if we stay on the current path, we could exceed temperatures of 3 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. But perhaps the most important number in the synthesis report is the fact that by 2035, global emissions need to be 60% below 2019 levels. Now, why is that the most important number in the synthesis report? It's because 2035 marks the end of the second round of nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, the vehicles that the governments use to commit to climate change actions. Those NDCs have to be prepared by governments in 2024 and submitted in 2025. So literally in the next 2 years, we as a society have to make those big choices which bend that curve dramatically by 2035. So this is not something that can wait. These are discussions we need to be having in this room today to ensure that that level of ambition is reached. And so it's very clear that it's about the choices we all make as individuals, the city makes as an institution, our country makes, the extent to which current and future generations will experience a hotter and more dangerous present and future. And this infographic shows us, if we continue on high emission pathways, the extent of global temperature increase will escalate, and that will have profound impacts on the lives of everyone in this room and generations still to come. The baby boomers might get away slightly less harmed, but if we begin to look at the millennials and the Gen Zs, they face a very, very dangerous future, and they're well aware of it. I was at a presentation to the Presidential Climate Change Commission with some other working group 2 authors on the synthesis report, and the Youth Commissioner indicated she had been speaking to the youth about their concerns in relation to climate change. And she indicated that one of the key feedbacks she was getting from some of her peers was they wanted the chance to die of old age. Now, how tragic a society we live in, where the aspiration of our youth is the chance to die of old age, as opposed to being at the behest of an extreme event or the collapse of biodiversity due to climate change. For me, that was a very telling observation from our youth. We must also remember it's not only going to be human society that's impacted. The WWF has taken our infographic and adapted it to show that it's not only human generations that are going to be negatively impacted by inaction today, but indeed generations within the natural world on which we are so dependent. So enormous responsibility on the shoulders of everyone in this room. And so it means that every decision we make counts. There's a very narrow window of opportunity we have. So this summit is extremely timeous to enable climate resilient development. So to pull together ambitious adaptation action, ambitious mitigation action with a view to making the world a safer, more equitable place. But that window is closing. And we need to realize our personal and societal responsibilities, because the choices that we take and that we implement in this decade are going to have consequences, both now for us, but also for thousands of years still to come. So that's an extraordinary responsibility we have as current society. But the good news is, and there is some good news in the mix, is that there are feasible low-cost options available for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to adapt to climate change. And Durban has led in some of these areas. We speak about key system transitions that are absolutely vital to drive this massive transformative change. So in our energy systems, the move to renewable energy, the widespread electrification of end users using that renewable energy. In industry, more sustainable production processes. In urban systems, better land use planning and retrofitting of our buildings, building new green buildings. We need, in the natural systems, to be conserving 30 to 50% of the world's natural ecosystems. In Durban, our metropolitan open space system represents 30% of the municipal area, but we're not doing enough to manage it. And so it's critical that we begin looking at those key assets of our resilience. We need to improve health and nutrition by providing basic services like clean water and create social safety nets for those who will be at the behest and impacted by losses and damages. So there really are multiple opportunities for action in terms of adaptation and mitigation. They often have co-benefits if you do them wisely, and they can have synergies with achieving sustainable development and improving equity for our broader population. But the message is there's no silver bullet. Don't think there's a technology or a policy that's going to come save us. There isn't. We need far-reaching transitions across all sectors. Everyone has to be involved. It's a whole of society, a whole of economy approach, and it cannot be driven without political will. Even the science says this, that the changes are required, are dependent on political and societal will, which is why it's so important that the mayor has called this particular workshop. There are policy measures that are available to us to respond to this challenge, to reduce emissions, to improve our resilience. We can scale those up. So things like targets, because that provides regulatory certainty that the private sector often wants. Regulations to support deep emission reductions. Insurance to reduce vulnerability. Technical innovation to reduce emissions growth. And international cooperation Everyone in the world needs to be working towards the same goals. Climate finance is absolutely critical, and for those of you who follow the climate negotiations, you know that it's always a testy element of those negotiations, but it's vital for climate resilient development, particularly in developing countries where we've got this huge finance gap, but also the greatest opportunity to make these big changes. And the good news is there is sufficient money around, we're just not putting it in the right places. So what does that mean? How do we move the money in different ways? Well, we need to scale up the financial flows from global capital markets. There's a lot of debate currently about the role of the IMF, the World Bank, the multilateral development banks, how they become more positive contributors. Supporting action through public monies coming from the developed world into the developing world. Grant-based financing is absolutely critical for adaptation, and we've got to prioritize that finance to the most vulnerable areas of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, and our most vulnerable communities, our informal settlements. Mitigation is slightly different because here we have to leverage in private sector capital using our public monies by reducing some of the risks in investing in mitigation activities in newer regions or developing regions of the world. But none of this is going to save us, even with all the money and technology in the world, unless we have a societal system which prioritizes inclusivity, justice, fairness, and sharing of different knowledges and values, which is what you'll be doing here today to support this transformative change. Because those transformative changes are most likely to succeed where we trust one another, where we work together to prioritize those risks, and we share the burdens equitably amongst us. And so the science is clear. We've got a great deal of science, thousands of pages of it. It's very clear that if we delay action, this window of opportunity is going to rapidly close in our face, and I'm hoping that some of that science will inform your discussions today. And if we're thinking about what small steps we can take from here, I challenge the ICC to finally rid itself of water bottles. These are extremely unsustainable. And in a conference center which should be promoting greening, we should not have these on our tables. So I challenge the ICC, your first step, please rid yourself of water bottles. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Roberts, and for making us understand that it's mainstreaming, it's the new mantra, that every human being now needs to get on board and we need to up our game. I think I qualify as a baby boomer, right? Yeah, okay. I was somewhere on there. But ladies and gentlemen, it's important here that Deborah gave us a really good insight, a global insight, and she brought it back to our country and our continent. But also, so today in the audience we have our leadership, our councillors and our deputy mayor and our speaker. Our mayor will be joining us shortly. We also have senior officials and officials from the municipality who are grappling with these issues and making sure that the city is resilient and is sustainable. And we also have members of civil society and the private sector here in the audience, because this journey, we have to do it together. And I think that's what Deborah has been saying. But I think the challenge would be, and we're going to allow for some engagement now, as a city, because we are not a national government in this audience here today, and as a city, in our local ward, in the city as such, how can we impact at a policy level, at a practical operations level or program level in the city? And I think that's something we want to think about, you know, based on what Dr. Roberts has said and what the speaker has also spoken about, and the mayor is going to add to that further when he comes. So, but in preparation for that, I'd just like to invite Sean, Mr. Ndebele and Ntumeleng to come on the stage here, because these are the operations people that, Mr. Ndebele, please join us. He's in the development and planning section of the city, and he'll also be able to just shed light on any questions that come up from the floor, because his job is to ensure that our development planning approvals are not compromising the safety of people and the loss of property. And Ntumeleng and Sean are the big champions on adaptation and mitigation strategies that Deborah spoke about. So, colleagues, I think we're going to interrogate a little bit and just get, if there's any further clarification that colleagues have from what Dr. Roberts said, and our speaker, Councillor Nyawose, and my colleagues here would also be, because as the program director, I know some things, I don't know too many things on the climate change front, but I do agree that international cooperation is really important. The more we learn from each other and share knowledge, it's an important journey. So ladies and gentlemen, can we get some microphones and some people to work the floor for us? Some roving microphones. And can we get one on the stage here as well? Sorry, can we just get, where are the staff that can do the running for us on the floor? We just need one person this side, one this side. And while we're getting the microphones, any hands, I'll take a set of questions of 2 or 3 and then we'll do another round. Any questions from the floor? The gentleman there with the waistcoat, any other ones? There's a hand at the back. The young lady there, we'll take one more. And the gentleman in the front of the glasses, and then we'll come to the 2 of you, okay? So the gentleman with the, oh, you got a microphone there, okay. I think you have to press the button. So sorry, that microphone doesn't seem to be coming very clearly. Can you just speak a bit closer into it? No, it's not coming through very clearly. Can we just give him another microphone, please? That microphone on the desk is not, we can't hear him very clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Just 3 questions. I want to find out, how does 10% of the highest households emit 40% of global emissions, and 50% of the lowest emit only 15%? Then the other thing I want to find out is, we need trees to change CO2 into oxygen. Solar panels creates more deforestation on energy. Should we plant more trees than solar panels? Because if we're going to solar panels to supply energy, a simple example, my motorcycle puts out 91 kilowatt. To change 91 kilowatt I get from my drop of fuel in my motorcycle, I need to put up a football field of 350 by 350 solar panels. I would rather have trees covering that area than deforestation, and rather burn coal, which is less impact than solar panels. That's the other thing. Then I want to ask, what do you say to Professor Nels Axel Morne? He started the United Nations Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change. This is the guy that they went to when the United Nations started the UNIPCC to investigate the effects of climate change. A couple of years later, he debunked it to say that climate change is a fallacy, that it does not exist. So the United Nations got rid of him. Then a few years later, they got a panel together to say that climate change is for real, but a hand-picked panel. I just want your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Those questions, and then the lady at the back, the young lady there. There's a lady there. Keep your hand up so they can see you. There was a third person this side. Did I miss someone? No. Okay, the lady at the back there. Okay, I think, was you the third person on this side? I don't know. Okay, there's 2 people here, and then we're going to come this side, and I'll come back to you, ma'am. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much Professor Roberts for the presentation and very insightful information. My name is Futhi Velagazi from Umgeni Water. I've got questions around the information that was shared on more focus being more on mitigation finance rather than adaptation. I think the research has shown and studies are showing that developing countries, Africa, is more vulnerable to the impact and needs more adaptation. But the focus seems to be more on mitigation, and we see this going even more with the concern that we are not going to be able to achieve the Paris Agreement. So what, at negotiation level, IPCC level, United Nations level, how are we representing Africa to be focusing more on adaptation? We understand the importance of mitigation, but our focus should be on adaptation more than anything. And this needs to also integrate mitigation that is understandable. The other question is on what is eThekwini is doing to foster integrated planning. I think Professor did indicate that we need a shared focus. We need to share this burden. What is eThekwini as the biggest municipality in this province of KwaZulu-Natal doing to ensure the integrated planning in terms of mitigation planning, in terms of adaptation planning? Because as indicated, the plans that we have are currently very sector specific and they need to be integrated. And we understand that the impacts are cross-cutting. We should be doing integrated planning. At the local municipality level, that's where I think there needs to be more focus in terms of advising and influencing integrated planning. Lastly, the one on the move to renewable energy, which is much needed in our country. What do we have in place to ensure that as a country we also contribute to the economy in terms of the development of technology around renewable energy, because most of the technology is coming from the global north or other countries and not in South Africa? And have we also analyzed how that is going to affect us in terms of job creation? Are we prepared? What are the thoughts around coal economy? We know that in South Africa, coal is an economic driver, but there is an emphasis in terms of reducing our use of coal. So what is the plan for KZN, for Durban? How are influencing, understanding that this is also an economic driver? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We've got those sets of questions from this side. But I just wanted to check, and the colleagues will answer those. I think it's really Dr. Deborah Roberts and Mr. Ndebele who can answer those. Is Sbu and Charlie? Charlie, where are you? Sbu, I saw you earlier. Sbu, from the Energy Office. Please come up on stage here as well. Sbu is driving our independent power producing plan in the city, and he hosted the Energy Summit with the mayor earlier this year. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to invite Dr. Deborah Roberts now to respond to those questions, and then Mr. Ndebele, particularly on the eThekwini response in terms of integrated plan. Dr. Roberts, you can come up here again.
Great, thanks for those questions. I'll pick up on the ones that relate to the global climate change science. So the first question is, how do you get a scenario where 10% of households are responsible for 40% of emissions and 50% are responsible for 15%? It's the level of consumption. So if you look in the global north, a lot of that industry has been carbon intensive for a long while. There are high levels of consumption. Think about things like fast fashion, the kinds of foods that are eaten. This creates huge carbon footprints in the global north compared, for example, to underdeveloped places in Africa where the levels of consumption are extremely low. And so it's a very easy way to understand that particular difference. In terms of solar panels versus trees, I certainly would argue with that. The science doesn't point to that. The solar panels are very efficient. Currently, my whole house is being run on solar, and we haven't felled a single tree for that. But we do point in the science that we've got to think about these synergies and trade-offs. There are consequences of all of our actions, and we need to be mindful, for example, as we move to electric vehicles, about the metals that are mined for those batteries and the impacts they have. And this is what the science is saying. Think about the full value chain. Think about the systems and all of the unintended consequences, because we're going to have to manage those as well. And in terms of who started the IPCC was in fact started by Bert Berlin. And he was very clear that climate change existed, and currently there is virtually unanimous agreement out of the scientific community about the link between human activities and climate change. 99% of the scientists who work on this are in agreement. So I would say that the science is very clear. We need to be acting now, not debating the science. Thanks.
Okay, you gotta, I think let's see if that microphone works there, Sbu. There's one over there. Sorry, yeah, by Sean. Because I think Mr. Ndebele and will answer the question of integrated planning, and Sbu will talk about technology and the just transition in terms of independent power producing. Over to you.
Thank you, Program Director. Dr. Sean will also rope in with the issue on the governance element.
So sorry, just 1 second. Sorry, can the ICC please go and tell those people to turn the music down? Can they please wait for their sound check? It's a bit disrupt. Can everybody hear clearly with the music in the background there? You can hear? Okay. Okay, speak a bit louder and... Okay.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about the topic on the integrated planning that was raised as to what is it that we are doing as the city. But I've just highlighted that I've got my technical guys that will spool on the technical aspect. But the governance element, Dr. Sean will also elaborate on that. With regard to the issue of the integrated planning, I must say I'm sure you are all aware that planning itself starts with the IDP, which is a document for the municipality, business plan for the municipality. But that IDP won't be realized without the spatial planning, spatial development frameworks of the plan to implement and ensure that that which is the vision of the IDP is translated into tangible, implementable element. So at the SDF level, I'm sure our colleagues that are coming from other line departments will also bear testimony to that just like the IDP, the SDF is done in consultation with various departments. One area that I would like to highlight is that we are already aware when you deal with the issue of both adaptation and the mitigation that if you recall vulnerability, especially when it comes to the issue of flooding, it's more to those people that are on the floodplains. I'm sure you also are aware as well that our cities, when they were designed many years ago, this issue of maybe climate change was not in the forefront, but also over and above that, most of our cities, when they were designed, they did not take into account flooding that we are now experiencing. I'm sure my colleagues will confirm with me that the kind of rains that we see would be what we call in engineering 1 in a 50-year flooding, 1 in a 100-year flooding. So when you go through the designs of the city along the catchment areas or river corridors, you will find that most of the developments are within the 1 in a 100-year flood line when it comes to proximity to the catchment areas. If they are not, maybe they were just by sheer luck. So one of the areas that we need to take cognizance is to recognize that any development that is within the prone areas, we need to take a conscious step to ensure that we either, in fact, I was interacting with the engineer, Mr. Jeff Toole from the stormwater, that perhaps the city over and above, we need to superimpose all our 1 in a 100-year flat line, 1 in a 50-year flat line on the entire city so that one will be able to see which areas are prone to flooding. But having said so, I must highlight that the issue of flooding to a large extent is happening in areas that had poor planning. If you look at what has happened in the Toyota, our engineers in their wisdom, they decided to channelize the river. They ignore the which acts as a sponge. Velocity of the water is going to be coming at it like a missile. So amongst other things that we need to revisit is to revisit those areas that are prone to flooding. Keep away development in those areas. Reintroduce perhaps, if it's possible, to resuscitate the wetlands. I'll cite a classical example where, in fact, we need to admire Dr. Roberts. I think in your PhD, whatever, I understand that I'm sure you heard of the DEMOS, Durban Metropolitan Open Space is in this house. This is Dr. Dr. Roberts that played the role. So at least Durban, we always say Durban has got lungs, green lungs, very unique to this city, that a city along the catchment areas, we have at least open spaces so that development is not exposed. Where it's exposed or close proximity of development in those areas. The other challenge is that, or the other intervention that we're doing is to ensure that, especially for those areas, I think human settlement, if they were here, we also have transit camp to try and keep people away that are in flood-prone areas. Those that are already in the flood-prone areas, I'm sure my colleagues may have some details. As I was having a discussion with Uthumi, our Deputy Head of Biodiversity, there is a good working relationship between the city, UKZN, and some of the communities where we have established an integrated early warning systems where they've got markers on certain water catchment areas. So if there is a water intensity taking place upstream, they will be able to tell the communities lower down, you know, this is part of the adaptation to say you need to vacate because that water coming at that speed, it's going to be reaching you at that same speed, but it would have taken a particular area in terms of the impact that it will have. It's not ideal because we're not supposed to have development along the floodplains anyway, but that's a situation that we find ourselves under, that we need to have at least early warning systems to deal with that. But coming to the issue of, I highlighted one of dealing with the issue of the flood lines that would need to be, you know, imposed. It's there, but we need to now make communities conscious, be aware of those areas around the adaptation. Around the mitigation, we are also interacting with our line departments like your ETA, I'm sure they are here, to look at the issue of mobility. We should reduce the greenhouse gas emissions by going the public route. In other words, we use mobility or automobile 6 engine or diesel, and you are alone in that vehicle. It's going to emit the same amount of emissions, whatever. If you were to use that same V6 vehicle on the bus that is carrying 100 more of the public automobiles, we will be able to reduce the emissions by going the public route. So what we are doing as an example, I'm sure some of you know of the C3 corridor that links Inc. and we are now looking and testing as a potential